to me after we began this series in September to be coming to the end of Genesis now. It, in many ways, seems like we just started it. I remember so much of what's gone before, speaking to you about all the different things that are contained here in Genesis, and I think you'll agree with me even more now that we've seen a lot of it. There's just a lot here. It is the origin of everything. It's the beginning point of everything in the Scriptures. Not just creation, not just when God said, "Let there be light," creating the heavens and the earth. It's not just the origin of that. It's not just the origin of tribes and tongues and languages. It's also the origin of God's dealing with mankind. God's dealing with the sin problem. How he goes from Genesis 3 after the fall when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit and they plunged the entirety of mankind into sin and depravity. And God promised in Genesis 3:15 that a seed would be coming from the woman to save mankind. And we've seen the development of that now as God has first appeared to Abraham and spoken to him, promising him a land, promising him a seed that will be countless and innumerable, promising him kings that would come forth from him. And we'll remember in verse 13 of chapter 15, I'll just read it. God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. And according to our text here, God predicted long beforehand the Exodus or the captivity of Israel in Egypt and their enslavement in Egypt. And God said, "But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions," thereby predicting now the Exodus that will come forth, in the book of Exodus. And it's all told him beforehand that in the fourth generation they will return to the land of Canaan. And he gives us reason that the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. He was giving the Canaanites time to fill up their sin so that he would be righteous and just to totally eradicate them from the land, to bring them out and to bring Israel in. And this is where we're coming to in Genesis. As we come to Genesis chapter 40 tonight, we're going to see the beginnings of this. We're going to see Israel now coming into the land of Egypt, fulfilling part of what God said already to Abraham. So we've already been looking at the life of Joseph, and we've seen how Joseph was imprisoned in Egypt. He had gotten there because his brothers hated him, and it said that they added more and more hate to him all the time when he would tell them certain things, and they would just hate him more. And so they eventually threw him into the pit, and then they took him out and they sold him to Ishmaelites, who then took him down to Egypt and sold him into slavery. By God's providence, Joseph ended up in the house of Potiphar, a guard for Pharaoh, a captain of the bodyguard, and then from there Joseph ended up in prison, having been wrongly accused of assaulting Potiphar's wife. And here we find him in prison. And in chapter 39, right before, we see that the chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. In verse 23, the chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. God's hand, even in such circumstances as being in prison, was so obviously upon Joseph and prospering him and making everything that he did better and better and prospering, that he was put in charge of many things. And so it comes about, it says, chapter 40, verse 1, that after these things, the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord. The word there is actually sinned. They sinned against their lord, the king of Egypt. And here in this chapter, you can mark this chapter down if you want a title, Two Official Dreams, or Two Dreams of Officials. And in verse 2, Pharaoh was furious with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Now, these were the two most important jobs in all of Egypt. These were the two men that were closest to Pharaoh. You had to be sure that you had two very honest men to fill these positions, because either one of these could very easily sneak in poison to Pharaoh. They control what he eats, they control what he drinks, and so usually a chief cupbearer would be the best friend of Pharaoh. He would be a very, very highly regarded fellow by Pharaoh. But here Pharaoh is furious with the bodyguard, or with the chief baker and the chief cupbearer. So he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, in the jail, in the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. Providence of providence. The captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. They were there for quite a while. It wasn't just in and out. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but Joseph has now been attending to them for some time. It doesn't tell us exactly how long. And then verse 5, the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in jail, both had a dream the same night, each man with his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning and observed them, behold, they were dejected. He asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in confinement in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" Then they said to him, "We have had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches, and as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand according to your former custom when you were his cupbearer. Only please keep me in mind when it goes well with you. And please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was, in fact, kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon." So here's the interpretation of the first dream. And now when the chief baker sees that it was a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I also saw in my dream, and behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head, and in the top basket there were some of all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Then Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh off of you." Thus it came about on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his office, and he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. That's such an amazing statement to me. How do you forget that? Except that God meant him to forget it. Now, in my reading for this week, one of the commentators asked a very pertinent question, one that we've been trying to ask as often as we can. What in the world is this chapter here for? Yes, it kind of helps the plot along, but it doesn't really tell us a whole lot about what's to come. It doesn't seem like such a long chapter, such a long recounting of this incident is as necessary as it is. And he had a really great answer for it. Why is this chapter here? Well, It's here because we are being introduced not just to Joseph as a young bratty boy now who was who was sent into slavery in Egypt, but now we are seeing Joseph as a Daniel-like figure, to use our language today, to think later in Scripture. But we're seeing him as this man who has a spirit of the living God in him, just as Pharaoh is going to recognize here in a few moments. This man who has the spirit of the living God in him, who can interpret dreams and who is wise beyond all measure. Isn't Joseph different from Abram? Doesn't he seem different from Isaac and different from Jacob? He's very different from them. Abram saw visions. He was a prophet. God told him many things that was to come. Yet Joseph has dreams and interprets dreams. He is a wise man beyond all accounts. And so here we're being introduced to this mysterious man, Joseph, who is able to do incredible things, and he always gives credit to God. He always says dreams belong to God, and their interpretations, verse 8, belong to God. Note here the providence of God. We've been seeing this over and over in this story of Joseph, this long extended narrative about Joseph. The providence of God and the imprisonment of the cupbearer and the chief baker with Joseph. They're all there at exactly the same time, at exactly the same place. We see not only here is Joseph then a vessel of dreams, but this chapter here shows us that he is also able to interpret them accurately. If you read the account of the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, you would probably come up with some different interpretations if you didn't know the interpretation that's given. In fact, the interpretation is not apparent at first glance. It's not even apparent sometimes with study, I think. But yet we're being shown here that the interpretation is of God, and that Joseph is God's chosen vessel to bring these interpretations. What a contrast to those who have gone before. Joseph is a faithful man used by God, a picture even of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now all of that sets up the stage for chapter 41. And this chapter is two dreams of an official. The last chapter, we could say, is two official dreams. This chapter is two dreams of one official. Now, it happened at the end of 2 full years. That's quite some time to pass. And Pharaoh had a dream. And behold, he was standing by the Nile. And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. He finds out that all of his wise men are incapable of interpreting this dream to him. They're all useless on this occasion. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offenses. The word there again is sins. Pharaoh was furious with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, both me and the chief baker. We had a dream on the same night, he and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dream. And just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. So this jars the memory of the cupbearer. After 2 full years of freedom, he now remembers, oh yes, there's this Hebrew slave down in the prison who we need to bring up, and we need to make him the official interpreter. We need to bring him up because he can interpret dreams correctly. And then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it, and I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Again, he gives all credit, all glory right beforehand to God. It's nothing in him. It's not a special ability that's just his in the flesh, but it's something that's given by God. And so Pharaoh spoke to Joseph. In my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. And behold, 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Lo, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such as I had never seen for ugliness in all the land of Egypt. Now he's recounting the dream just as the narrators already told us, but he's adding 2 more details. This is the first one. They were very ugly, very gaunt, such as he had never, ever seen before in his life in all the land of Egypt. And he says the lean and the ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. And this is the second detail he adds. Yet when they had devoured them, it could not be detected that they had devoured them, for they were just as ugly as before. Then I awoke. Then I saw also in my dream, and behold, 7 ears, full and good, came up on a single stalk. And lo, 7 ears, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. Then I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. He could not find anybody in all of his court, anybody in all of his kingdom who could explain this dream to him. Very likely he had some understanding that the 2 parts were all one dream, and when they were interpreting the different parts, he would recognize that they were just making things up. And so he was happy to have Joseph here explain it to him. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now, I love this. A Hebrew man of about 30 years old is standing before Pharaoh and just proclaiming God before him, the true God, the creator of heaven and earth. This is what God says. Oh, that we would be bold to do the same. God has told Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 thin ears scorched by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. He keeps coming back to this. This is God who's giving the dream, and it's God who's giving the interpretation. So behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt, and after them 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land, so that the abundance will be unknown in the land because of that subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. This is his interpretation of it, given by God. Not only that now, but he's going to continue as a young Hebrew man who was just in prison for many years, or a couple of years, I guess. Now he is going to give Pharaoh advice. He's going to be so bold as to advise Pharaoh. Verse 33, Now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Then let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up the grain for the cities under Pharaoh's authority, and let them guard it. Let the food become as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine." And the proposal, by the grace of God, seemed good to Pharaoh and to all of his servants. Here we see God moving the heart of Pharaoh to accept what Joseph has said. And then Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is a divine spirit?" He recognizes that Joseph is different. He recognizes that Joseph is probably different from any man that he's ever met. He's already just found out that all of his wise men are totally useless and inept. And so he says to Joseph, "Since God has informed you of all of this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put the gold necklace around his neck. He had him ride in a second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, "Bow the knee," and he set him over all the land of Egypt. That is quite a promotion, isn't it? From the dungeon to the Pharaoh's chariot. From prisoner clothes to the official clothes of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife. Here Joseph marries into the nobility of Egypt, the upper nobility at that, one of the highest families in all of Egypt. Joseph marries into it. And Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. Now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt, probably to tour it and to see the people, so that all the people would see him. From the reading that I've done on Egypt, it seems like that was a normal thing for the pharaohs and those who were under the pharaoh to go throughout all the land so that people could see them and do homage before them, and so that the official could see the land and all it had to offer. During the 7 years of plenty, the land brought forth abundantly. So he gathered all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and placed the food in the cities. He placed in every city the food from its own surrounding fields. Thus Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it, for it was without measure. I can't imagine that much grain, can you? Just imagine the storehouses they probably had to contain it. That would probably provide many jobs just to build the storehouses. Now, this is what I appreciate about Scripture, is it's so laser focused. Take chapter 40, for instance. You and I, if we were going to write this down, we would write 2 or 3 chapters just on the biography up to that point of the cupbearer and the chief baker. But yet they're just introduced in Scripture with pretty much no introduction. The Pharaoh, even though the Pharaoh is most likely changing every once in a while in different parts of the story, is never mentioned by name. It's never said who he was. It's so laser focused. And here we just skip through the 7 years of plenty, and we're going to skip through 2 years of the famine, almost in a couple verses, because the writer has a point. This is theology. This is not just history. This is theology. This is for us to learn the providence of God. This is for us to learn how God cared for his people. And so now, verse 50, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh. That means to forget. For he said, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. He named the second Ephraim. For he said, God has made me fruitful. Ephraim means fruitful in the land of my affliction. When the 7 years of plenty which had been in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said, then there was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. Thereby the word of the Lord was fulfilled. Verse 55, so when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, whatever he says to you, you shall do. When the famine was spread over all the face of the earth, then Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. The people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the earth. By the way, Joseph named his children with Hebrew names. They're not Egyptian names. He was still maintaining his heritage. And notice that it says that Pharaoh renamed Joseph, but even when Pharaoh speaks, Pharaoh calls Joseph, Joseph. He is still maintaining his heritage. He is still looking toward the land of Canaan. He is still holding on to the promises of God. And in fact, he's probably holding on to those dreams that he had all those many years ago. Now, chapter 42. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt. And Jacob said to his sons, why are you staring at one another? I was looking at one of my old study Bibles from when I was a teenager, and right beside that verse or that sentence, why are you staring at one another? There's this big smiley face. I just always enjoyed that sentence. Why are you staring at one another? He said, behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down and buy some for us from that place so that we may live and not die. Thereby Jacob foreshadows this entire chapter, that they're going to go down to Egypt so that they may live and not die. Then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, I am afraid that harm may befall him. So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Hereby Joseph's first dream is fulfilled. His brothers have come and they have bowed down before him. And when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. Now, it's been about 20 years at this point since they've seen Joseph. He's grown up quite a bit, I'm sure, and besides that, Hebrews tend to wear their beards and body hair and stuff like that, and then Egyptians tend to be clean-shaven for sanitary purposes. And so they probably don't even recognize him at all. There would be no way that they would really recognize him. And he said to them, where have you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. But Joseph, says again, had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he had said about them, or which he had about them, and said to them, you are spies. You have come to look at the undefended parts of our land. Then they said to him, no, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. I love the irony there. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies. A family would not send 10 sons to spy out a land. It just wouldn't. That's not smart. There goes most of your heirs if they're found out and they're killed. Your servants are not spies. Yet he said to them, no, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land. And that would have been typical. They would have been checked at different parts along the way to ensure that they were not spying out the land in order to come and to overtake it and to rob all of the food for themselves. But they said, your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is alive with our father today, and one is no longer alive. Joseph said to them, it is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you will be tested, by the life of Pharaoh. You shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you that he may get your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. He keeps repeating this to wear them down. So he put them all together in prison for 3 days. Now, he can't keep them very long because they need to get back with food. He knows that his father's household is waiting on this food. So after 3 days, verse 18, Joseph said to them on the 3rd day, "Do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison, but as for the rest of you, go, carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words may be verified, and you will not die." And they did so. Then they said to one another, "Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us." Here they begin to recognize that they're getting what's due them. And in the presence of Joseph, they're saying these things because they think he can't understand them being an Egyptian. And yet he's hearing all of this, and he's starting to put pieces together of what happened. And he's starting to see their hearts now. Verse 22, Reuben, remember the firstborn, answered them, saying, "Did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now comes the reckoning for his blood." And of course, you remember what happened with Reuben, that he was trying to save Joseph and said, "Don't kill him, throw him into the pit." And it was not his idea to sell him into slavery. And so now Joseph is getting that piece of the puzzle that he may not have known before. Verse 23, they did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. He turned away from them and wept. But when he returned to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Remember, Simeon was the one that was most responsible for selling him to the Ishmaelites. He was the one that came up with the idea. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey, and thus it was done for them. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain, and they departed from there. Now most likely he put their money back in their sacks, one as a kindness, but also two to kind of make them sweat. It's hard enough to return to the land to begin with. But now to come when you're having to crawl on your hands and knees and say, somehow my money ended up in my sack. So he's really testing them here. He's pushing them hard. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain. They departed from there. As one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of his sack. Then he said to his brothers, "My money has been returned. Behold, it is even in my sack." And their hearts sank. And they turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this that God has done to us?" Here comes more of the reckoning. When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, "The man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies in the country. But we said to him, 'We are honest men, we are not spies.' We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no longer alive, and the youngest is with our father today in the land of Canaan. The man, the Lord of the land, said to us, 'By this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me, and take grain for the famine of your households, and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you are not spies, but honest men. I will give your brother to you, and you may trade in the land.' Now it came about as they were emptying their sacks. I would love to have been there and seen their faces. As they were emptying their sacks, that behold, every man's bundle of money was in his own sack. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were dismayed." Now imagine Jacob at this point. He knows that they're untrustworthy. He knows that they've done some pretty silly things beforehand. So imagine Jacob's thoughts at this point when he sees them open the sack and the money comes falling out. And he said, "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin. All these things are against me." It seems here that Jacob thought that they had sold Simeon for food. And so he's saying, "I'm not going to give you Benjamin to go back. Are you crazy? My favorite son, now that Joseph is gone, you want to take him from me as well?" Then Reuben, the firstborn, again trying to make things right, spoke to his father, saying, "You may put my 2 sons to death, if I do not bring him back to you. I can't imagine telling grandparents that. You can just put your grandchildren to death if what I say is not right. Well, it doesn't quite work with Jacob, does it? You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you. But Jacob said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. Now, there's a big to be continued under that. It feels a little funny to stop there, doesn't it? But we'll return here in a few weeks, and we'll pick up right where we left off, and we'll see how this plays out. And it all plays out according to the will of God. And it all happens that Israel, the house of Israel, 70 people, I believe in all, come up, or down, I guess, go down into Egypt. And they are made safe for all these years, ready for God to bring them out by his sovereign hand. And of course, we know that he does. And he knows that through all that time, he cared for his people just as he cared for Joseph when he was in the pit, and Joseph when he was in prison, and Joseph when he was before Pharaoh, that he was working every little detail, even when it just seemed like it was spiraling out of control, like things just couldn't get any worse. God was in control. And God exalted Joseph. Just as we saw this morning, he exalted his son, Jesus Christ, who went down to the grave, having been crucified on the cross. He exalted him. In fact, Paul said, I said this morning, he super and hyper exalted the Lord Jesus Christ to be Lord of all. And this is the Lord that we serve. This is the Lord that all of this is leading up to. It's one big arrow on the timeline pointing straight to Jesus Christ, straight to the cross of Christ, straight to the ascension, straight to the kingdom of Jesus Christ. That's what all of this is about. It's just how God is working and has been working in history from Genesis, the very beginning of all things. And he will continue to work until every single thing that has ever been written in this text, in all of this book, will be fulfilled. How good is God? Father, thank you for your word, for your great power in bringing everything to pass, that you are in all of the details, that nothing happens without your sovereign care, that not one particle in all of this universe moves without you knowing it, and not one